For most of my adult life, I have been terrified of depending on someone financially. Not uncomfortable, not cautious, not simply concerned, terrified. For years, I explained this fear to myself in practical terms. I told myself that I simply valued independence, that I wanted security, that I wanted freedom, that I wanted to be responsible for my own life. And while all of those things are true, over time I began to realize that there was something much deeper underneath them. Because if this fear were only about money, it would not feel the way it does. It would not sit in my chest like a weight. It would not keep me awake at night. It would not make me question my worth. It would not make me feel as though my freedom, identity, and future were somehow at risk. At some point, I realized that what I was feeling was not really about money at all. Money was simply the doorway through which a much older fear was entering my life. One of the most fascinating and painful things about childhood is that we absorb lessons long before we understand them. Children are always watching, always learning, always trying to make sense of the world around them. But children do not analyze life the way adults do. They do not have the experience or emotional tools to understand complex relationship dynamics. Instead, they look for patterns. They observe cause and effect. They pay attention to what creates safety and what threatens it. And whether we realize it or not, every child is asking the same question: am I safe? When children grow up in stable environments, they rarely think about this question consciously. But when children grow up around instability, conflict, uncertainty, emotional tension, or power struggles, safety becomes something they become hyper-aware of. They start paying attention to whatever appears to control it. Sometimes it is money. Sometimes it is housing. Sometimes it is the mood of a parent. Sometimes it is all of those things combined. And the lessons we learn during those years often stay with us long after the circumstances themselves have disappeared. As a child, I witnessed situations that taught me something powerful about the relationship between money, power, freedom, and security. Not because anyone sat me down and explained these concepts, but because I lived them. I watched how financial power could influence decisions. I watched how money could affect people's choices. I watched how security could feel uncertain. I watched how some people seemed to have more power than others. And slowly, without realizing it, I formed a belief. A very simple belief. Dependence equals vulnerability, and vulnerability equals danger. The strange thing about childhood beliefs is that they often survive long after the circumstances that created them. They become invisible rules. Rules we never consciously choose. Rules we simply inherit from our experiences. And then we spend years organizing our lives around them. Looking back now, I realize how much of my adult life was shaped by this fear. I wanted my own income. I wanted my own career. I wanted my own savings. I wanted options. I wanted to know that if life ever became difficult, I would be able to stand on my own feet. I wanted to know that my future belonged to me. At first, I thought this was simply independence, but eventually I began to wonder whether there was something else underneath it. Because there is a difference between choosing independence and needing independence in order to feel safe. There is a difference between freedom and fear. There is a difference between strength and self-protection. Many people who grow up around instability become highly independent adults. From the outside, this often looks admirable. They work hard. They become responsible. They save money. They avoid relying on others. They pride themselves on being self-sufficient. People often praise these qualities, and rightly so. There is nothing wrong with independence. The problem begins when independence stops being a value and becomes armor, because armor protects us. But armor is also heavy, and sometimes what looks like strength from the outside is actually fear underneath. Sometimes we are not being independent because we genuinely prefer it. Sometimes we are being independent because we are terrified of what might happen if we are not. That realization was difficult for me, because I had built so much of my identity around being capable, around handling things myself, around not needing anyone. around proving that I could survive. But eventually I had to ask myself a difficult question. Am I pursuing independence because I love freedom, or because I am afraid of dependence? Those two motivations can look identical from the outside, but internally they are completely different experiences. One comes from confidence, the other comes from fear, and fear has a way of disguising itself as virtue. The deeper I looked, the more I realized that my fear was never really about money. The fear was much bigger. The fear was losing control over my own life. The fear was losing the ability to choose. The fear was becoming trapped. The fear was waking up one day and realizing that my freedom depended on someone else's decisions. When you have experienced uncertainty around security, freedom, or power during childhood, this fear can become deeply rooted. Because your nervous system learns something very specific. It learns that safety is fragile, that freedom is fragile, that security can disappear. And once those beliefs become deeply embedded, adulthood can become a constant attempt to prevent those experiences from ever happening again. The problem is that life eventually confronts us with situations where complete independence becomes impossible. Relationships require vulnerability. Love requires vulnerability. Partnership requires vulnerability. Building something meaningful often requires vulnerability. Life eventually asks all of us to trust people, and for those of us whose relationship with trust was shaped by fear, that can feel terrifying. Recently, I found myself in a chapter of life that brought all of these fears to the surface. Life became uncertain. The future became less predictable. I found myself in a position where I had to trust processes that take time. Trust things that cannot be controlled. Trust that what I am building will eventually bear fruit. And suddenly, all those old fears came rushing back. Not because I had become a child again, but because the situation activated old emotional memories. And I think this happens to more people than we realize. We often think we are reacting entirely to our present circumstances, but sometimes we are reacting to old wounds that have been reopened. A present challenge activates a past fear. A current uncertainty awakens an old emotional memory. And before we know it, we are carrying two burdens at once: the actual problem, and everything the problem reminds us of. That is why certain fears can feel so overwhelming, because we think we are carrying today's weight, when in reality, we are carrying years of accumulated emotional history. For a long time, I thought one of my biggest fears was becoming a burden. The idea of needing help made me uncomfortable. Receiving support made me uncomfortable. Imagining myself relying on someone made me uncomfortable. It felt as though my value somehow decreased the moment I could not fully support myself. But then, I started asking myself a question. If someone I loved was struggling, would I see them as a burden? If my partner lost their job, would I think less of them? If a friend was going through a difficult period, would I resent them? If a family member needed support while rebuilding their life, would I view them as a burden? The answer was obvious. Of course not. I would want to help them. I would support them because I care about them. I would never define their worth by a temporary season of difficulty. And yet somehow I was applying completely different standards to myself. I was offering compassion to everyone except me. And that realization forced me to confront another possibility. Maybe the fear was never really about becoming a burden. Maybe the fear was about becoming powerless. Maybe the fear was about losing freedom. Maybe the fear was about finding myself in a position where I no longer had choices. Maybe the fear was about reliving emotions that had never fully left me. I've come to believe that people who grow up around instability often become very good at giving. We become reliable, helpful, responsible, supportive. We become the people others can count on. But we often struggle with the opposite: receiving. Because receiving requires trust. Receiving requires vulnerability. Receiving requires admitting that we cannot carry everything alone. And for people who learned early in life that vulnerability can be dangerous, that feels incredibly uncomfortable. Sometimes receiving support creates guilt. Sometimes it creates shame. Sometimes it creates fear. Sometimes it creates an overwhelming desire to prove that we deserve the help. But healthy relationships require both giving and receiving. No meaningful relationship can survive if only one person is allowed to be vulnerable. No meaningful relationship can survive if only one person is allowed to need support. The ability to receive is not weakness, it is trust. And trust is something many of us are still learning. One of the most important realizations I have had is that support and control are not the same thing. This may sound obvious, but for people whose early experiences connected the two, it is not obvious at all. When support and control become intertwined during childhood, we begin to associate vulnerability with danger. We assume that receiving help means surrendering power. We assume that support comes with strings attached. We assume that dependence inevitably leads to loss of freedom. But healthy support is fundamentally different. Healthy support expands your options. Control reduces them. Healthy support strengthens autonomy. Control weakens it. Healthy support says, I believe in you while you find your footing. Control says, you owe me. Healthy support says, we are a team. Control says, I have power over you. The two may look similar on the surface, but emotionally they are worlds apart. Learning to distinguish between them can change your life. What I am slowly learning is that fear is not always a sign that danger is present. Sometimes fear is simply a sign that pain was present once before, and those are not the same thing. I am also learning that receiving help is not the same thing as becoming dependent. Accepting support during a difficult season does not erase independence. Needing encouragement does not erase strength. Allowing someone to stand beside you does not diminish your autonomy. Life is not a straight line. There are seasons of growth, seasons of certainty, seasons of success, and there are seasons of waiting, seasons of building, seasons of uncertainty, seasons where we are asked to trust that we can make it through without losing ourselves. Perhaps the greatest lesson I am learning is that the goal of life is not to become someone who never needs anyone. The goal is not perfect self-sufficiency. The goal is not invulnerability. The goal is not to build walls so high that nobody can ever disappoint us. The goal is to build a life where we can remain free, maintain our dignity, preserve our autonomy, and still allow ourselves to be supported when necessary. Because true strength is not measured by how much you can carry alone. True strength is measured by your ability to remain yourself even during seasons when you need help carrying the load. And perhaps the most important realization of all is this: your worth is not determined by your income. Your worth is not determined by your productivity. Your worth is not determined by how much you can endure without asking for help. You do not become less deserving of love when life becomes difficult. You do not become less valuable when you experience uncertainty. You do not become a burden because you are struggling. Human beings are not machines. We are not investment portfolios. We are not productivity projects. We are people. And people were never meant to carry everything alone. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is stop fighting so hard to prove that we need no one. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is trust that accepting support does not diminish our freedom, our dignity, or our worth. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is allow the people who love us to love us. And perhaps that is what healing really is. Not becoming fearless, not becoming independent of everyone, not reaching a point where uncertainty no longer affects us, but finally learning that vulnerability and safety can exist in the same place. That receiving does not make us weak. That support does not automatically become control. That needing help during a difficult chapter of life does not mean we have failed. It simply means we are human. And if I am completely honest, I wish I could end this reflection by telling you that I have figured it all out. I wish I could tell you that I no longer feel afraid. I wish I could tell you that I have completely healed these wounds, that I have all the answers, that I never doubt myself anymore, and that I move through uncertainty with perfect confidence. But that wouldn't be true. The truth is that I am still struggling. Some days these fears still feel very real. Some days I still find myself worrying about the future, Some days I still question whether I am doing the right thing. Some days I still wonder whether I am strong enough, capable enough, or prepared enough for what lies ahead. The truth is that right now I do not have all the answers. I do not know exactly how everything will unfold. I do not know when every fear will disappear. I do not know when uncertainty will finally feel comfortable. I do not know how long it will take for me to fully trust that I am safe. And maybe that is the part of the story we do not talk about enough. We often hear people tell their stories once everything has already worked out, once the business succeeded, once the relationship survived, once the fears were conquered, once the ending was written. But most of our lives are not lived at the end of the story. Most of our lives are lived in the middle, in the uncertainty, in the waiting, in the questioning, in the not knowing. That is where I am right now. I am not speaking to you from the mountaintop. I am speaking to you from the climb. I am speaking to you from a place where I am still trying to understand myself, still trying to separate old fears from present realities, still trying to trust, still trying to let go of beliefs that no longer serve me, still trying to understand that my worth is not measured by my productivity, my income, or my ability to carry everything alone, still trying to believe that receiving support does not automatically mean losing my freedom, still trying to believe that I can be loved even when I am uncertain, still trying to believe that vulnerability does not always end in pain. Some days I make progress. Some days I don't. Some days I feel strong. Some days I feel terrified. Some days I believe everything I have said in this video. Some days I struggle to believe any of it. And maybe that is what growth actually looks like. Not certainty, not perfection, not arriving, but continuing. Continuing despite fear. Continuing despite uncertainty. Continuing despite not knowing exactly where the road leads. I am still learning. I am still questioning. I am still unlearning. I am still growing. I am still a work in progress. And perhaps that is not a weakness. Perhaps that is simply what it means to be alive. Because the moment we stop pretending to be finished is often the moment we become more honest, more compassionate, and more human. So if you are listening to this and you are struggling too, if you are carrying fears you do not fully understand, if you are trying to rebuild something, if you are waiting for life to make sense again, know that you are not alone. I do not have a perfect ending for this story. Not yet. Maybe one day I will. But today, I am still in the middle of it. I am still learning. I am still healing. I am still growing. I am still afraid sometimes. I am still hopeful. I am still a work in progress. And above all, I am still human. And maybe I won't be able to figure this out for a very long time. And it's okay. If you have experienced or you are going through similar things, please share and comment. Also, please subscribe, as it would help grow my channel. Yours humbly, just an eldest daughter.